This is lecture 6 from chapter 17, and this section is going to be talking about how species interact together. Starting off this section with this picture of the moth and the orchid. And the reason why is because this is a great example of how species co-evolve together. And this moth is actually from Madagascar. Darwin actually predicted that this moth existed. He never got to see it. The orchid that is in the picture is actually an orchid that is recorded in Darwin's pictures and in his books because he collected this orchid while he was in Madagascar. And this orchid, you can't see all of it, this portion of the flower reaches back almost 11 inches, and he had speculated that there had to be an insect, most likely a moth, that could actually make it to the end of the bottom of this orchid because that's where the nectar is located. And sure enough, about I think 20 years ago or so, someone finally was able to get video of this moth. And the proboscis, its tongue, is about 11 inches long. So it's the only insect that is able to get to the bottom of the orchid to get to the nectar. And so these two interact with each other as pollinator and pollinatee, if you want to think of it that way. So the thing is without the moth, this orchid will not be able to be pollinated. And so if one of them disappears, the other will probably suffer. So what I want to look at next is basically what we call the niche. So we often think about animals having a habitat, which is kind of where they live. But really, it's more than just that, and that's what a niche is. So a niche is not just the habitat, the place where an organism lives, but it also includes don't know why I keep yawning today. It includes things like the kind of food that an organism is going to need, when an organism is going to reproduce. So are they going to reproduce in the spring? Are they going to reproduce in the summer, the winter? Are there specific temperatures that that organism needs? And, what organisms is it a food source for? So who eats it? And then who does it interact with? And so these all together are actually a lot more than a habitat and is very important as far as the interactions that they will have with other organisms. So let's take a look at what happens when these niches are going to overlap with each other, because this is our first big interaction between organisms. So what we have here is competition. So when we've got these two paramecium by themselves in their little test tubes, they are perfectly fine. The populations will grow to large numbers. But if we put these two paramecium together in the same test tube, their niches overlap because these two species have a lot of the same requirements. They may need the same sorts of food, the same sorts of temperature, whatever it might be. And so they're going to start competing with each other. And so like I said, this is competition. And when organisms compete, we see two different outcomes. And so the two outcomes that are possible are what we see here. And the first one is this one on this side, competitive exclusion. And its name actually tells us exactly what happens. The organisms compete until somebody gets excluded. So in the case of the paramecium, you can see one of them died because they couldn't escape. That is one option. The other option is that we get what we call local extinction. And so if the other organism can escape, you still get local extinction because they take over the one that was better at using the resources, but they don't necessarily have to kill, outcompete and kill indirectly the other species. That other species could move to another area where maybe they don't have to compete for those resources. So we've got competitive exclusion, where one species uses those resources more efficiently and drives the other species basically to extinction. The other option is what we have over on this side, resource partitioning, where the two species alter their niche to divide up the resources. So they're still able to use the resources, it's just that they're not using them to their optimum. And so the two won't get as big of a population as they had up here when they were by themselves. But, for example, the green Paramecium are going to hang out towards the top because they do better up there. The purple ones are going to hang out towards the bottom. They do a little bit better down there. This way, neither of them is going to get excluded. They both get to use the resources, but neither population is going to get, very big. And we actually see a lot of resource partitioning, especially in things like birds and lizards, because if you look at and watch birds, a lot of birds will actually sit in different parts of trees. So some birds will sit farther out on limbs, some species, and other ones will sit farther inside of the tree. Some species will sit farther up in the tree, and other species specialize to sit farther down in the tree. So these relationships actually have already mostly evolved over time with us not even paying attention. So competition is one interaction that we see that has evolved over time. Predation is another interaction that we're all very familiar with. This is where one organism is eating another. And so this is going to produce adaptations in both predators and prey. We're going to look at both. Most of the adaptations we see generally show up in the prey, in whoever's being eaten. There's a lot more at stake if you are the one who might get eaten. So these prey adaptations to keep you from getting eaten basically fall into two big categories, either physical defense or behavioral defense. And so we're going to look at examples out of each of these groups. So physical defenses first. So you can have a mechanical defense, and this is true whether we're mainly going to be looking at animals here, but this is true whether you're an animal or a plant. So if you think back to the plant lecture, we saw mechanical defenses like thorns and spines and nettle bristles, things like that. Anything to keep organisms away from you. If you're pokey, that's a mechanical defense, like this porcupine here. But you can also go a different way with a mechanical defense and build yourself something like a shell. So things like turtles and tortoises, they have armor. Things like armadillos, things like that, they also have mechanical defenses. It's just instead of being, pokey, you hide inside of your armor. And so mechanical defenses are any sort of structure that helps you defend yourself against attack. So also, other things that could do this, things like horns, claws, things like that, are also going to be in these mechanical defense sorts of situations. You can also go chemical defense, and I will link the video here. That's a video about skunks. I will make sure that that video link is in with the list of the videos for lectures. So you can go with chemical defense. We saw some of those in the plant lecture. So we use a lot of the plant chemical defenses as medications for ourselves, but those are to keep things from eating them. And animals do the same thing. So this poison dart frog, he is going to excrete chemicals to either make himself taste bad, or very often the poison dart frogs are actually toxic. They're not the only ones that produce chemical defenses as far as animals go. There are butterflies and jellyfish and sea slugs. There's a whole wide group of chemical defense organisms that do this to protect themselves. Along with chemical defenses, a lot of organisms have warning coloration. This is basically a, hey, don't eat me, bad idea, back off. So this is a monarch butterfly, the one well known here in Ohio. Monarch butterflies, when they're caterpillars, consume milkweed, which is a kind of nasty toxic plant. And what's interesting is that those caterpillars actually store the toxins in their tissues as they're caterpillars. And when they turn into adults, that material is still in their body. And so that makes them toxic to things like birds. Young birds learn very quickly that these colors and patterns mean don't eat that. Because they do taste bad, but they're also toxic and will make birds vomit. So, yeah, kind of fun and interesting to watch. Warning colorations, usually bright colors like reds, oranges, yellows. But the warning coloration is not just the color, but also the patterns. So you'll see patterns like this with the stripes. Think bumblebees, snakes that are venomous. They are going to come with these bright warning patterns. The last of the physical defenses is camouflage. So you can go either warning coloration, back off, or you can camo and hide yourself. So we saw these guys at the very beginning of the semester, the praying mantises. And so these guys go the opposite direction and hide. And you can camouflage yourself in lots of different ways. So the most common way is to make yourself look like something else. As you can see here, you can make yourself look like a stick, or you can camouflage yourself as another organism, maybe something that looks bigger and scarier than what you actually are. Remember things like this. Praying mantises are kind of both. They're hiding from their predators, birds, and they're also, in this instance, hiding from their prey, so that they get kind of a bonus in both directions. So behavioral defenses, these are kind of interesting. I'm actually going to start my next video with the behavioral defenses so that I make sure I have enough time to talk about them. So I will start that on our next lecture video.